Hi, I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott.
And this is LA Not So Confidential, the forensic psychology and true crime podcast.
Each week, we explore the intersection of psychology, the criminal justice system, and entertainment.
Today, our episode is on the forensic psych topic of necrophilia.
So welcome back, everybody. Wow, Dr. Shiloh, we've had a full day. We were just recording already for another show this morning, right?
Yeah, but I like these full days rather than you and I like all day, every day, cranking out twice as much content.
Right.
So thank you to all our listeners for allowing us to step back.
It's nice after 2 years to be able to breathe and still be able to dive in. I mean, today's episode is going to be a good bit longer, but it's because we have the ability to do that now. We can take more time. That's pretty great. So welcome back, everybody. This is, again, our episode is going to be on necrophilia. We have spoken tangentially about it in the past, but we've never really done, a deep bite.
Laughing during this episode.
Oh, right. So yes, I hope no one in themselves has been touched by this, because it's certainly is a very, very far end of the paraphilic scale that we've spoken about in the past. And we're going to get into the research, the science, what there is out there, which is not a lot. There's some interesting discussion, but not a lot of actual research. But really interesting about the legality of this particular paraphilia and how it varies state to state in the United States.
Yeah. And laughing is a defense mechanism. That's okay. And like, if this is the first episode of ours that you're ever listening to, please go back and listen to all our episodes so you can get to know us a little bit better.
Right. It is true crime psychology and snark. So
yeah, exactly. But before we get to all that, our last episode 182, was on extremism in the military and law enforcement, disturbing in its own way. We tackled case studies and psychological motivations for the development of extremism within the U.S. military and, of course, with law enforcement personnel. And as you know from listening to prior similar topics, some of the most notorious extremists in the U.S. military are responsible for the bombing of Oklahoma City Federal Building, also brutal racially oriented murders by soldiers at Fort Bragg, and the Fort Hood shootings by a jihadist military psychiatrist. So really covers the gamut in some of the more extreme cases. And additionally, in that episode, we looked at how extremism within law enforcement presents a dual threat that impacts both the integrity of the profession and the trust, which is crucial for building effective relationships within their communities. So very interesting stuff, you guys. If you haven't checked it out, please go listen to it. So, I guess on to our other topic. Not much lighter, but here we go.
Yeah. It's really not lighter. It is disturbing and different in its own way. And we have so many episodes. This is number 185. And looking at the big picture of everything that we've gone over in the past few years, I can't imagine that if you're even a sporadic listener to our show or a fan of true crime, that the term necrophilia hasn't popped up somewhere along the way. But if there is someone out there who isn't up to speed on the far fringes of paraphilias and criminality, necrophilia is also known as necrophilism or thanatophilia. And it's a paraphilic disorder characterized by a sexual attraction to corpses. And this term comes from the Greek words nekros, meaning dead body, and philia, meaning love or friendship. So you're getting friendly with the dearly departed and then some, right? Yes. So this condition is actually listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the DSM-5 TR currently. It's under the category of other specified paraphilic disorders, meaning that it involves what we would be considering to be atypical sexual interests, but it is specified due to its very specific and distinct focus on deceased individuals. And that actually kind of opens up into a myriad of pathways for discussion. So we're going to try and stay focused.
Yeah. And what the DSM did differently in the last couple go rounds with paraphilias is calling them paraphilic disorders. So for instance, like with voyeurism, it would be voyeuristic disorder rather than just voyeurism. Same goes for necrophilia. However, we're just going to say necrophilia to like cut out one other word here. And we are still evolving with how we utilize our language. So sometimes it takes a little bit for us to then like throw on disorder on there as well. But
Right. And as you've said in many episodes before, that a paraphilia is not necessarily a harmful thing if it's not causing harm to anyone, if both partners are consenting, and so on and so on and so on. I mean,
sure,
certainly with necrophilia, that individual or that what is left of that individual, the remains, cannot offer consent.
correct.
Right. So, I mean, as weird and kind of uncomfortably funny as that is, it's still a consent issue, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you think we need trigger warnings on this?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably kind of obvious as usual. We're staying away from graphic depictions today,
Right.
but we will be speaking of some sexual activity with dead bodies, as well as sexual assault on living and unconscious people, sometimes as a result of drugging, as well as some other brief mentions of murder and homicide. So just listen with care for those issues.
Right. There's a pause and a stop button if it starts to get uncomfortable for you. So we appreciate you as our listener doing what you have to do. So let's talk broadly about this. How long has it been a problem? There is room here for a history lesson. It's a particularly valuable one from Herodotus, who is often described as the father of history. He was an ancient Greek historian born in what was once named Halicarnassus, and it's now in the midst of what would be modern day Turkey. But he was born around 484 BCE, and he's most famous for what is considered to be one of the earliest examples of historical writing in Western literature. And this is actually very interesting given the time and given the way we look at scientific method now, because his approach to history was very novel for that time. Rather than mixing it in with myth and the literature of the time, he really sought to systematically collect, to scrutinize, and then to re-narrate and record historical events and cultural practices, which could vary widely from region to region. It was really a very early form of scientific method. So Herodotus combined direct observation with the collection of stories and testimonies from others, which he sometimes reported with a degree of skepticism, much like Dr. Shiloh and I as forensic psychologists, right?
I like it.
So already I'm a fan. Also, some of his accounts are seen as anecdotal or embellished. The work that he laid a foundation for just remains today invaluable for its insights on the ancient world and contributions to critical inquiry. So how do we connect Herodotus's histories to necrophilia? So one of the earliest reports of a measure being taken to prevent necrophilic actions was from his writings on ancient Egyptians. Now, there is controversy out there that this might have been a hit job on the Egyptians, and it could have been some sort of classical times racism from culture to culture. But he reported on the measures taken by ancient Egyptians to prevent acts of necrophilia during the embalming process of attractive females, particularly females that were highborn, royal, or wealthy. And according to him, the Egyptians were acutely aware of the potential for sexual violations of the recently deceased, particularly those who were young and attractive. And to mitigate this risk, the ancient Egyptians implemented specific precautions. The bodies of these women were not immediately handed over to the embalmers. They were left to decompose for a few days to make them less appealing to those that might act upon them. So they were hoping that this delay would serve as a deterrent to any kind of immoral acts by the embalmers or anyone else within striking distance, basically. And these accounts underscore the societal awareness and proactive measures taken at that time to attempt to uphold what would be considered sanctity and dignity for the deceased, reflecting broader concerns about moral conduct and the protection of the vulnerable even in death. It's also really important to remember that for the ancient Egyptian populations, you had to preserve the body because your body was going to be with you when you woke back up in
Right.
the afterlife.
Right.
So you had to be in good shape, but they were willing to like, let's keep my ex-wife sacred. Let's take care of her body
Right.
by letting her go for a couple of days in the hot desert sun before we embalm.
It's almost like they could see into the future, like with what we covered in our funeral crimes episode.
Yes, there's
in
definitely an
terms
overlap
of,
there. Right.
people who might take advantage of the situation. But we will get back to some history and some more historical context in a second. But let's first take a moment to review necrophilia as a specific paraphilia. Longtime listeners will recall that a paraphilia is the experience of intense sexual arousal to atypical objects, situations, fantasies, behaviors, or particular individuals. It has been defined as, quote, sexual interest in anything other than a consenting human partner. So there you go. But the attraction for clinical purposes has to rise to the level of inducing distress in the person as a result of that attraction, which we have talked a lot about how the DSM, sometimes that very last criteria is that disorder has to induce distress in that person, right? Bring it to a clinical level. So it needs some intervention, perhaps.
So let me ask you this then, because this is where I did not find that research, or I want to make sure I'm clarifying the terms in the way you were familiar with. A paraphilic disorder is indicating that it causes distress to the individual who's experiencing, right?
Correct.
But a paraphilia can just be a fetish.
No. Paraphilia is paraphilic disorder now.
Got it. Okay.
So,
Thank you
yeah.
for the clarity. I stand corrected. See, here I need to keep up with the changes in the DSM.
So theoretically, and even though, the DSM is not a be all end all of how we make diagnoses, it's a guide, right? Somebody, if we're using necrophilia, someone could have a sexual attraction to dead bodies. And if there is zero distress caused by this, which would be very unlikely considering that it's not culturally appropriate to
It's not typical
express
for
that,
our
right?
culture, right?
But let's say hypothetically there was no distress, then no, it wouldn't rise to the level of necrophilic disorder. So yeah, we might put it in a less clinical category like a fetish or a kink or something like that. So as far as how a paraphilia forms, because I don't think we've really dove into this a ton as many times as we've talked about paraphilias, there is support for a variety of theories. And I think, especially with necrophilia, people are like, and how did that happen? Right. So most paraphilias typically manifest during adolescence, often stemming from experiences or relationships in early childhood. Once established, they tend to persist chronically, although some studies suggest that these behaviors may decrease with age, right alongside libido and sexual interest and things like that. While biological factors may contribute to some paraphilias, researchers have not yet pinpointed a specific biological or biochemical cause. Instead, psychological factors really appear to be central here. In many cases, one or more childhood events led individuals to associate sexual pleasure with certain events or objects, hence leading to the development of that paraphilia. However, behaviorists propose that paraphilias develop through a process of conditioning, wherein non-sexual objects can become sexually stimulating when consistently paired with pleasurable experiences. Certain sexual behaviors, such as voyeurism, exhibitionism, which can elicit particularly intense erotic pleasure, can then become preferred by an individual. So if they had to rank things that they're attracted to, if that becomes their top preference, then we start to look at how that is being conditioned and what role that's playing in their sexual life. Additionally, some individuals may have a predisposing factor, such as challenges in forming personal relationships, which can contribute to the development of some paraphilic behaviors. So this more behavioral model is what I explored with a lot of my clients in the sex offender treatment world. We spent a lot of time talking about how, for many of them, they would condition themselves to various types or genres of pornography, illegal pornography, and where that then led. And the question was always sort of like a chicken or the egg scenario. Was this interest always there, and then it was woken up somehow? Or was it freshly introduced, paired with sexual pleasure, and then conditioned? So super interesting stuff. And sometimes to recognize that in sex offender treatment, the purpose is because if it was conditioned, that we know you can extinguish that. You can go backwards. And if you're not sort of putting fuel on that fire, you can start to extinguish the pairing or the conditioning.
So many people are completely unaware of that. I mean, sex therapists, even at the master's level, like marriage and family therapists or social workers who are trained in sex therapy, will often talk about this with people of, yeah, if you constantly expose yourself to this particular thing, you're conditioning your behavior just like you would condition a pigeon to hit a button for food or
Yep.
something, right? So you can
Right.
do the opposite, but it is a lot harder. And I remember when you and I worked together in sex offender treatment, there were a few of these guys that had absolutely broken the law in the collection of child sex endangerment images, but their stories were backed up by the FBI file of like they started off with just run of the mill pornography and they say oversaturated themselves and then they had to go for more extreme, more extreme, more extreme. So did
Right.
they actually fit the criteria for pedophilia? You know, sometimes I go, I don't really think they do. It doesn't matter. They still broke the law
Totally.
and you are
Totally.
now on lifetime supervision, but you could see a pathway that was radically different from the typical pedophile.
Yeah. I mean, the language that started to happen in the industry when I was still seeped in it and the research was, can we start to talk about some of these paraphilias as being in remission, right? Like if that behavior has been extinguished, that sexual attraction has now been extinguished through behavioral modification, perhaps that diagnosis doesn't need to follow them forever, or does there need to be a little in remission label on there too?
Well, I'm really glad that the research is heading that way because we have to stay in our science, which is so many times considered to be soft.
Yep.
That is the hard edge that is so important to keep fresh and sharp. However, let's get back to necrophilia.
Yeah.
So again, some historical context on top of Herodotus's writings is that there have been elements that are present in various descriptions, art, and literature throughout history. Not a lot, but it's pretty notable. I mean, and interestingly, that in using the previous example of the Egyptians, again, like I was saying, they have an enormous emphasis on the importance of the body and the afterlife and the certain levels of where a person goes in the afterlife based on what their actions were during life. But what's also interesting is that there's a really significant myth there in ancient Egyptian belief systems, and that involves the gods Set and Osiris, who were enemies. Set killed Osiris and dismembered his entire body. Isis, Osiris's wife, reassembled his body after she found all the pieces, but she could not find his penis. So she
Hmm.
substituted another phallic object and reattached it. She then engaged in intercourse with Osiris's body, which mythologically highlights a theme of resurrection and fertility within their belief system. And I think also it's noted that the process of sex with Osiris's reattached body was what brought him back to life.
Got it.
But still, really reaching there, Isis made a tough decision
Well,
and
yeah.
good
I'm
for
glad
you.
she found something else, though.
Yeah. It kind of leads you to think of, well, what did she find? But
It was the
let's
more
not go to,
sterile option, perhaps.
yeah, let's not go down that path. But the Greeks, they closely connected with the Egyptians after Alexander the Great's conquest, and they also had cultural references to necrophilia. Norse mythology, the goddess Hel, goddess of the underworld, she's associated with death and decay, and some interpretations suggest necrophilic undertones in the myths around her. Also in Hindu mythology, the goddess Kali is sometimes depicted in this way that also implies like necrophilic symbolism. She's covered in body parts, has I think a belt made of skulls and many of her conquests, and she's often shown standing on a corpse. And that is supposed to represent the destruction of the ego and the transformation that follows death. So,
Hmm.
not direct necrophilic connections, but an emphasis on death. We could also say the same thing about Western Christianity, is like we put a lot of focus on the afterlife and what happens to the body. There's some even Protestant belief systems here within the US that say absolutely don't cremate the body because I got to have my body for when we're all raptured. Very,
Yeah.
very interesting
Or
stuff. And
how
there's,
hot Jesus always looks like,
oh, yeah, he's always got like an 8 pack, right?
right?
They always want to give Jesus an 8 pack. There is theorization in many Victorian literature dissertations and writings that the abject romanticization of young women who were languishing from tuberculosis may have also contributed to a paraphilic development and interest in necrophilia, because there was this emphasis of like you got more beautiful as you got closer to death. And
Wow.
some of the symptoms of tuberculosis and even anemia would be like even, making a woman more pale or making her look a little bit more robust. So yeah, it gets real
Lovely.
complicated there.
Well, especially when we start talking about it in terms of like romanticizing some of those things, even if it's not explicitly sexual. But it makes me think about like, the success of the sexualization of stories of vampires. Again, they're always super hot. I mean, I don't know if that's what that's about, but they're the undead, right? I mean,
Well, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because the original vampires were absolutely not. Like, if you even go back and read the descriptions of Dracula, and
oh,
Dracula
right.
was not the first novel. There was, I think, 200 years before, there was a Russian author that wrote about a type of vampire in Russian called the Urdalak. And
Mm,
it was not described as pretty as all at all, except as maybe they could convince their victims that they were attractive. But even the glittery, sparkly vampires of the Twilight series, it's like, you're dating a dead guy.
I know.
Like, come
Yeah, I
on.
mean, it's interesting because I think in previous paraphilia, probably a million years ago, like our first few episodes, reminds me of the phenomenon of paranormal porn, especially like writings of it that are so popular with women, where there's like full on series about Bigfoot and ghosts and vampires, and it is very sexualized. But again, just one other weird way that we sexualize the undead, and it kind of weaves more into maybe not popular culture, but if you look on Amazon and look up those books about Bone and Bigfoot, they're pretty damn successful.
Yeah, there's also some Tyrannosaurus Rex porn as well. So,
Oh,
I mean,
lovely. There's something for everyone out
whatever
there.
floats your boat.
Well, necrophilia was first mentioned by name in a more academic manner in 1850 by Belgian psychiatrist Joseph Gislan, but it was Richard von Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis in 1866 that provided the first detailed description and analysis of the condition. Krafft-Ebing explored the mental health implications of necrophilia, noting that, quote, an abnormal and decidedly perverse sensuality is required to overcome the natural repugnance which man has for a corpse and permit a feeling of pleasure to be experienced with a cadaver. And he further observed that unfortunately, most reported cases did not include an examination of the perpetrator's mental state, which he would have liked more of to be able to
Right.
write more on because he was exploring that. And as a result, the question of whether necrophilia was quote unquote compatible with mental soundness really remained unresolved at that time. But Krafft-Ebing made the very obvious statement that anyone familiar with the extreme deviations of sexual instincts of this kind would hesitate to dismiss the possibility of a mental disturbance going on.
Yeah, I mean, especially at that time. I mean, I'm not even sure they would get into the science of it. It'd be just like
Right.
a resounding no. So there is a little bit of research that's more recent in Rosman and Resnick's research article entitled Sexual Attraction to Corpses, a Psychiatric Review of Necrophilia. The authors were able to review 122 cases that reported necrophilic acts or fantasies. So Rosman and Resnick placed necrophilia behaviors into three types of attraction. So number one is called necrophilic homicide, which is the act of committing murder in order to obtain a corpse for the purposes of sex. But regular necrophilia is just the desire to have sex with remains, although what they do not do is subdivide this category into situational versus non-situational. And then finally, we have necrophilic fantasy, and it's the fantasy of, but no actual physical fulfillment of this attraction to deceased individuals, including animals, by the way. So that
Yeah.
was interesting to me. I was not expecting that in this research, as not just humans, but also, I mean, there's certainly, bestiality would be a paraphilia, but
Mhm.
that's a particular subdivision as well, the necrophilic bestiality. The research asserts that number one, neither psychosis, developmental delay, or sadism are inherent in necrophilia, but that the most common motive for engaging in the act is a way to engage in sex with an unrejecting and unresisting partner.
Yeah. So definitely put a pin in that for possible motive when we talk about some later discussions today.
Absolutely. It's completely intrinsic to this whole discussion. But point number 2 is that necrophiles will often follow career paths or pursue occupations that put them in contact with corpses, but some necrophiles who had employment related access to corpses also committed homicide. So this tracks with what we see with other kind of paraphilias like pedophilia, where a particular occupation can put someone intentionally in a position to have access to their preferred and available victims. So Rosman and Resnick eventually defined a 4th category of necrophilia called pseudo-necrophilia, and this will refer to individuals that have what would be called a transient or non-permanent attraction to corpses, and they generally prefer contact with living sexual partners. So Rosman and Resnick illustrate this with a case of a man who accidentally shot and killed his wife, became sexually aroused while hiding her body, and then engaged in sexual acts with the corpse. Additionally, other authors use the term pseudo-necrophilia to describe those who have sex with someone pretending to be dead or who masturbate to fantasies of sex with a corpse rather than having actual physical contact with the dead. This latter behavior aligns with Rosman and Resnick's previously mentioned 3rd typology of necrophilic fantasy. And at the end of this episode, we will talk about a surprisingly successful TV show with a character who
Yeah.
exhibits this.
I'm going to talk about a more extensive typology or classification system in a second, but I wanted to keep Rosman and Resnick's in here because I think it really looks at how we can kind of look at the different gradients of paraphilia, right? Someone can have like a fleeting thought of something that is atypical or unusual. And again, it goes back to people don't always have to act out, and they can meet the disorder and be distressed by it and have the
Right.
sexual attraction, but choose to never act out on that behavior.
Yep.
All the way up into, their number 1 category was those that are committing homicides to do this, to gain access. So to, very extreme criminal behavior to get their sexual fantasies met. In 2009, author Anil Agrawal created the most extensive system for classifying necrophilia in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine. He described 10 categories. And while doing this part, I learned that the dictation feature on my Mac really doesn't like spelling some of these things out.
Oh, I have found that very same thing. Yeah. It's like, oh no, the Mac does not want me to say that. It's like it's putting like its little hands over its ears, like, no, I don't want to listen to that.
It'll put like little stars to like fill in the word. It does not want to hear about our podcast. Anyway, okay. So the first one, I'm just going to run through these fast. We're not going to go into a full description of each of them, but the first one is role players. So those who are aroused by sex with the living person pretending to be dead. And we've heard of that on occasion, maybe even referenced it, where perhaps they will even have the person bathe in an ice bath to have their body feel cold, etc. Then you have the romantic necrophiles. So bereaved individuals who prefer their loved one's body or parts and continue to relate to them sexually as they did during the life of the deceased. So we will also talk about a criminal case later in this episode where that is the case. And then the third category is necrophilic fantasizers, those who only fantasize about sexual intercourse with the dead but don't act out. Then we have tactile necrophiles, people who need to touch a corpse in an erotic manner in order to achieve orgasm, but perhaps aren't performing intercourse. We also have fetishistic necrophiles, those who remove a part of a previously dead body and use it for sexual pleasure. And then we have necromutilomaniacs, people who derive sexual pleasure from mutilating a corpse while simultaneously engaging in masturbation.
That is so wildly specific. I mean, every time I think we've gotten
I know
as far as specifically as we can go, then open up another level.
Yeah, no doubt. And he's a leading researcher in this area and has authored books. And so I don't doubt that every specific case study they really see these little differences. So he's chosen to really encapsulate it all here. Then we have opportunistic necrophiles, those who are generally content having sex with the living, but would like to have sex with a corpse if the opportunity arose. And then 8 is just called regular necrophiles, individuals who derive pleasure from having sexual intercourse with the dead and actually prefer them to the living. We have homicidal necrophiles, people who resort to killing in order to obtain a body with which to have sex. And then lastly, exclusive necrophiles, those who will only have sex with the dead. So that's very similar. Again, we're kind of looking back at comparing and contrasting to pedophilic disorder is you have exclusive pedophiles and you have non-exclusive pedophiles. So the non-exclusives also have sexual attractions to adults, but the exclusive pedophiles would be those that only have the attraction to the prepubescent children.
Yeah, it makes me think in rom-com terms of, hey, you want to be exclusive?
Right.
Exclusively what?
Ooh, stay away from that word.
Yeah. Okay. So as the research that you have referred to is getting to be more and more robust, it still is difficult to get a lot. I mean, he's really, really done a great deal of breaking those down into even more distinct subcategories. One of the reasons this would be so difficult clearly is because there's stigma, there's a lot of secretiveness associated with his behavior. Usually those with the disorder have to interact with the legal or the mental health system in order to be detected and then examined. So we've got a limited subject pool, right? So like you were saying, we have some robust data from this research, but it's going to be naturally difficult to find it. And of course, what would be the factors involved in this? It's about stigma. It's about secretiveness that is associated with his behavior, because those that have the disorder have to interact with the legal or mental health system in order to be detected and then examined. So you have limited subjects, means you have limited research, right?
Yep.
And in preparing for this article, we did a search on PubMed, and that revealed only 57 articles containing the word necrophilia. So this highlights really the lack of knowledge and interest in this phenomenon in the current literature. And most of the existing information comes from single case reports and descriptive studies, right? So even though we don't have accurate rates of this disorder within the general population, this specific paraphilia is still considered very rare. And there has been documentation of some commonalities among those that have the disorder. So limited pool of information, but here are some of the things that they found. So a lot of this comes from particularly infamous serial killer cases, right? Including some names we won't repeat for the millionth time on a true crime podcast, because you've heard them all. We know you've heard them all.
We
right?
know you know.
Right. So when we look at the commonalities, developmentally, they tend to have been raised by what would be called inadequate parents, those that would be on one end of the spectrum, they would be abusive. And then on the other end of the spectrum, they would be completely neglectful. These individuals engage in antisocial or sexually dysfunctional behaviors as youth. I'm not saying antisocial personality disorder. I'm saying antisocial in terms of how they interact with the world around them. Some engaged in sexual behavior with dead animals prior to sexual behavior with human corpses. And that could be what we consider like possible rehearsal behaviors. And then finally, in some cases, other paraphilic disorders were present, as we know to be true with paraphilic disorders in general. They tend to travel in threes.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's interesting because, when we look at possible dynamics going on here and maybe a victim that you can be in total control of or that can't report the assault, to me, bestiality makes perfect sense as to why possibly those two would be present at the same time. And who knows what the third one would be, but yes, that's generally what we see. There's some other info that is present and some commonalities that I think are a bit of a no-brainer, but to be comprehensive, here we go. We know that those with necrophilic disorder tend to share many characteristics of those with antisocial personality disorder. So think things like a disregard for others and their safety or rights and a lack of remorse or empathy. Also, most offenders are men, especially when homicide is part of the process. They are not typically psychotic or intellectually disabled. So I think that was in some of the earlier research where the researcher found that psychotic disorders and developmental delays were not synonymous with necrophilic disorder. as well as often drugs or alcohol are consumed to decrease inhibitions to be able to do some of these acts. Lastly, necrophilia among morgue workers is far more common than people think, which again, we covered very extensively in episode 128 on funeral home crimes. So over the years, researchers have hypothesized as to the motivations of such behavior, particular to necrophilia. And back in the 50s, J. Paul DeRiver, trailblazer yet disgraced criminal psychologist here in Los Angeles, suggested that necrophilic acts were a way of further degrading a victim. Acclaimed FBI profilers Roy Hazelwood and John Douglas offered up that the behaviors might be a way to call greater attention to the necrophile's disdain for society, which I thought was super interesting. And then Rossman and Resnick tend to point to a, quote, profound lack of self-esteem, coupled with an intense fear of rejection and the desire to completely possess a partner. And they very intently use the word possess. Interestingly, they also play with the hypothesis that reaction formation may be at play here. So reaction formation is a defense mechanism in which people express the opposite of their true feelings, sometimes to a very exaggerated extent. So Rosman and Resnick posit that necrophiles actually intensely fear the dead and as a result develop a sexual attraction to them. So as far as motivations go, we have a whole mixed bag here.
Right. Because, and again, it's a mixed bag because you can't divide down any further without more cases to work with. You don't have data to pull this stuff apart. But fascinating. So let's move into the criminal ramifications, as it were. Necrophilia was really only criminalized relatively recently. For instance, in 19th century France, there was no specific law against necrophilic behavior. And as a result, a high-profile offender, Sergeant Francois Bertrand, who mutilated bodies and engaged in sexual intercourse with corpses found in graveyards, was eventually convicted of vampirism and sentenced to 1 year in jail, which is another complete mind
There you go.
fudge. Like, okay, you're a vampire, so we're going to put you in jail for a year as opposed to what you did to these bodies. But throughout history, various charges have been used to seek justice for immoral and horrific behaviors. Examples include convictions for, quote, unquote, wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization, as well as illegally driving a hearse and interfering with a burial. So it's conflating two very different actions that to us in modern day judgment would seem very, very different, right?
Yeah, that's the best they could do. Like, that's the best they could charge them with because there just wasn't anything on the books.
Yeah. So the same thing of, diddling a corpse would be compared to your apple cart happens to block the hearse that's on its way to the graveyard. Right.
Yeah. Well, they got you with something.
My apologies for diddling a corpse. I know someone's going to be offended, and I apologize. That's not appropriate of me. In the United States, necrophilia is illegal now in most states. We're giving you the side-eye: Massachusetts, New Mexico, South Dakota, Vermont, and Virginia. Harsh side-eye.
Time to update your books.
Yeah, and it's like an interesting cornucopia of states. It's not in any one. It's not in any one particular region.
Right?
It's like just like across the U.S. There you go. Not really sure what is in the water in those states. Must be a river that's flowing through all of them. Additionally, there is no federal law addressing this crime here in the U.S. So there's no federal law about this. It's all state laws. Here in California, it is a felony as outlined by Health and Safety Code 7052. And I'll quote some of this to you really quickly. Every person who willfully mutilates, disinters, removes from the place of interment, or commits an act of sexual penetration on or has sexual contact with any remains known to be human without authority of law is guilty of a felony. And then it goes on to define sexual penetration, which is pretty clear. And then sexual contact means any willful touching by a person of an intimate part of a dead human body for the purpose of sexual arousal, gratification, or abuse.
Yes. So California, we got it covered.
Yep.
All right. So I know at this point, some of you might be asking or thinking to yourself, but what about the Bill Cosby situation?
Yep.
And if some of you are like, wait, what? Then let's just do a little review here. So in late 2014, numerous allegations surfaced against Bill Cosby, known here in the States as America's Dad, for his role as Cliff Huxtable on The Cosby Show. And these allegations consisted of dozens of women accusing him of sexually assaulting them throughout his career. And Cosby faced accusations from over 60 women in total. These accusations included rape, many instances of drug-facilitated sexual assault, sexual battery, child sexual abuse, and sexual harassment, with the earliest incidents allegedly occurring in the mid-1960s. The allegations gained significant attention following a stand-up routine by comedian Hannibal Buress in October of 2014, which referenced Cosby's, quote, being a rapist, end quote. Subsequently, many additional claims were made, with the reported incidents spanning from 1965 to 2008 across both the United States and Canada. Cosby has consistently maintained his innocence and denied the allegations. In response to the accusations, numerous organizations severed ties with him and revoked previously awarded honors and titles, as they should. That's you.
Legally, there have been many civil suits filed. However, many of the criminal instances fell outside the statute of limitations, unfortunately. Cosby was brought up on one criminal charge in 2015, and in July 2015, court records from a 2005 civil suit against him were unsealed and made public. In his testimony, Cosby admitted to engaging in casual sex involving the recreational use of the sedative hypnotic drug methaqualone, which is also known as Quaaludes, with several young women. And he acknowledged that distributing the prescription drug was illegal. In December 2015, 3 felony charges of aggravated indecent assault were filed against him in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, based on allegations by a victim regarding incidents in January 2004. Cosby's first trial in June 2017 ended in a mistrial. However, at his retrial in 2018, Cosby was found guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. Later that year, he was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in state prison and fined $25,000, plus the cost of prosecution amounting to over $43,000. So frustratingly, to say the least, Cosby appealed the verdict in 2019, and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court later granted him that appeal. In 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that an agreement with the previous prosecutor prevented Cosby from being charged in the case, leading to the overturning of his conviction. This decision prevents him from being tried on the same charges for a third time.
Okay, so why are we bringing this up? Well, there were some talking heads at the time discussing perhaps a sexual interest in necrophilia after Cosby admitted to drugging women before having sex with them, and the women reporting being drugged and waking up after an apparent sexual assault. But then an attorney for one of the victims spoke out about something called somnophilia being a possible issue in his behavior. Also known as the sleeping princess syndrome, somnophilia is a sexual paraphilia where individuals are aroused by someone who is unconscious or asleep. Dr. Michael First, a clinical psychiatry professor at Columbia University Medical Center, theorizes that the perpetrator's or fantasizer's arousal may come from having full control over that other person. It might also be related to the lack of consent, the thrill of getting away with something, or simply the visual appeal of a sleeping person.
All those folks that were Team Edward in Twilight, and he just loved watching Bella sleep. Would just sit in the room and stare at her sleeping. Yikes.
I think that's like our third vampire reference in this episode.
Yeah, but same show, right?
Totally, I know.
Exactly. So somnophilia involves deriving sexual arousal from intruding on, caressing, or fondling someone who is asleep, but typically without using any kind of force or violence, or the idea of commonly understood force or violence. Definitions can vary to a slight degree, and some people suggest that it involves sexual intercourse with a sleeping partner, while others include engaging in sexual activities with an unconscious person. So there's still not a lot of clarity in that division. This variation might be influenced by the use of drugs like Rohypnol, commonly known as Ruthies, and those are linked to sexual offenses such as date rape. And there's no specific term for someone who is the recipient of such advances, except of clearly sexual assault victim. And this scenario is thankfully more often a fantasy than a reality. So signs of somnophilia may include recurring thoughts about unconscious or sleeping individuals and feeling sexual urges when near them. Treatment is usually unnecessary unless the behavior becomes destructive, problematic, or, most importantly, criminal. Speculative treatments would include hypnosis, behavioral therapy, and 12-step programs.
Right, which are all behavioral based and talk a lot about the behavioral modifications that we were speaking of earlier. Empirical knowledge about somnophilia is limited with no substantial data on its prevalence, causes, or treatment. Historian Richard Berg suggested a continuum from somnophilia fantasies to necrophilia, describing somnophilia as actually pseudo necrophilia because both involve non consensual acts with an unaware or unconscious person. In a 1972 issue of the Journal of Psychoanalysis, psychologists Dr. Victor Calif and Dr. Edward Wenshi, who coined somnophilia as Sleeping Beauty syndrome, proposed that it was the neurotic equivalent of necrophilia. They speculated, using Freudian theory, that somnophilia might stem from unresolved Oedipal issues, pregenital stage fixations, and castration anxiety, though these theories are hard to empirically validate, of course. And then in a 2006 paper, Mark Knowles examined the sexual fantasies of Irish novelist James Joyce, noting an instance of somnophilic fantasies in Joyce's letters. Knowles suggested that somnophilia's origins might be similar to fetishism and coprophilia involving castration anxiety. So a lot of psychoanalysis stuff for you in
Yeah, it's
past
interesting.
writings.
I'm not sure I would necessarily go make an overlap. I would like to see more research on how someone is trying to connect necrophilia and coprophilia. Those just seem wildly different, but if
Sure.
there's science out there, I'd be interested in reading it. Not for pleasurable reading, but for knowledge. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But talking about some other research and opinion and academic presentation, Christina Eugene in her 2006 thesis explored the cultural politics of sleep. And she suggests that sleep can objectify individuals and transform them into inanimate objects to be controlled. Then Carolyn Fay's 2002 thesis discusses the erotic fetish for sleeping individuals, emphasizing the absence of consciousness as the attraction.
That's interesting.
Very interesting. Both of these very interesting insights, and really, to me, would hold more water than making a connection to coprophilia. As you can see, real world examples can really start to highlight somnophilia's criminal aspect. And in 2016, a man in Florida was arrested for drugging and sexually assaulting an unconscious woman, which goes on to example somnophilia's dangerous and illegal potential. These kind of cases, including those such as the chronic Cosby allegations, just highlight this need for a greater and expansive understanding, as well as commensurate legal measures to address this particular action, even though it exists in such a small part of the population.
So this is great. I think we're kind of building our library here. We had Stockholm Syndrome with Beauty and the Beast. Now we have somnophilia with Aurora and Prince Philip.
Again, folks, LA Not So Confidential and Disney just colliding in the way that we really didn't picture. And of course, we'll get another review of like, oh, a podcast that's hosted by two Disney adults. Of course, we'll get that
Of
review,
course.
right?
Well, we should own it.
I do own it and I enjoy it. And I pitied a fool who is not able to enjoy Disneyland. I really do.
I actually saw a social media post from Jamie Rice that was at CrimeCon, and she's like, oh my God, our hotel was like Disneyland, which is a nightmare for me.
I love Jamie.
I know. So for our first criminal case, if this one sounds familiar to you, it's because we covered it on our friend Mike Morford's podcast called Beyond Bizarre. Go give his shows a listen. He is a true crime podcast empire over there with what he's doing. He has a lot for you to choose from.
Yeah, he's very prolific in his creations, and it's also such high quality stuff. It's just wonderful. But again, I doubt you have not heard of this, because this particular crime has been discussed in the last 30 years in all sorts of media, because it is truly, truly strange. And it is the story of Carl Tanzler from 1930. Very bizarre story of a man who is also known as Count Karl van Kosal, and he was an X-ray technician and a self-proclaimed nobleman. That's an important part, self-proclaimed nobleman, and we'll circle back around to that after the description of the crime. He was born in Dresden, Germany in 1877, and while there's a lot of contradictions in his background history, it is reported that he spent much time in India, Australia, and the Netherlands before heading to the United States. He married Doris Anna Schaefer in 1922, and the couple had 2 children after a brief stay in Havana, Cuba. They settled in Florida in 1926, and he set up his work as an X-ray technician. But just as quickly as they had found a new home, Tanzler again left his family and found an apartment in the exotic island-like community of Key West, Florida. So, taking an abrupt departure from the banality of his former family life, Tanzler started this new life for himself. Now, this gave him a fresh start to invent any kind of background that he wanted. So he was telling people that he was a European count, as well as claiming to be a former submarine captain and an esteemed inventor. So, supporting himself in his actual field of education and study, he was hired as a radiologist at the United States Marine Hospital in 1927, where he examined a number of tuberculosis patients. At this point, his full transition into a new identity is complete. He's completely left behind his wife and kids in another city. He grows an impressive beard that sculpted his face in this sort of aristocratic style, and he began working under the name he invented, Count Karl von Cosel. Tanzler claimed that when he was a child, he was on a trip to Italy and had visions sent to him from a distant relative. That distant relative's name was Countess Anna Constantina von Cosel, and she revealed to Tanzler in a vision the love of his life, an exotic, beautiful, dark-haired woman that he was destined to meet.
He's already a handful of a psychological case to work with.
So much. I'm
A
literally
grifter,
checking off boxes.
Antisocial, just leaves his family. All right. Well, while working in the TB ward, he met a beautiful 22-year-old Cuban patient named Elena de Hoyos and immediately identified her as the woman his visions had predicted, although he was 30 years her senior. Elena lived with her family, and she had been married at age 16, but abandoned by her husband when they suffered a miscarriage. Elena was eventually diagnosed with TB, for which there were no real successful treatments at the time. Tanzler became quickly infatuated with her and was determined to keep his quote-unquote soulmate alive and in his life. He essentially started treating her with a number of different elixirs and tonics, and even brought an X-ray machine to her home to monitor her disease for her. And it said that he professed his love for her, but that she did not reciprocate the romantic feelings at all. And plus, she's trying to just fight an illness.
Stay alive. Yeah.
Maybe she's not super interested. Unfortunately, his efforts and his love were not enough, and she died from complications of tuberculosis on October 25th, 1931. Tanzler paid for her funeral and for her internment in a stone mausoleum in the local cemetery. He was the only person who had a key to this building, and he would visit her every night. And understandably, her family grew to be very uncomfortable with this situation.
Yeah. So aside from all the psychological benchmarks that we're checking off, it's now turned into a horror movie that this man is
essentially
going to the graveyard every night and letting himself into the mausoleum. Also, something to remember, much like New Orleans, Key West is very, very, very close to the sea level. So there are very few actual burials. There's a lot of above ground burials in mausoleums or concrete or marble or granite crypts. So 2 years after her death, Tanzler stopped visiting the mausoleum. This would have given relief to the family, but what was later discovered was that he lost his job and he was slowly declining in mental health, leading him to make some pretty extreme measures in order to be with Elena. It's not that he stopped visiting her. He had not abandoned his soulmate despite her tragic death. In the dead of night, however, he had surreptitiously slipped into the mausoleum and taken her decaying corpse to a makeshift laboratory in his home. There, in the quiet solitude of a mad scientist laboratory, Tanzler mummified Elena's body with plaster of Paris, wires, mortician's wax, and glass eyes. And for the next several years, Tanzler lived with Elena's corpse in his home. As Elena's body degraded further and further, he tried everything to keep her intact. Wire hangers to prop her up, rags to stuff the empty cavities of her body. He continually applied wax to her face and disinfectants to her body to keep the smell of the corpse from overpowering his apartment. Tanzler also bought perfumes and gifts and even fashioned a wig in a desperate attempt to maintain the delusional fantasy of a domestic relationship with his soulmate. The townspeople, of course, eventually figured it out. It's Florida. The seasons are intense there.
Yes.
There's no way disinfectant is going to cover that smell. People would talk when he was seen about town purchasing gifts for a woman, and a neighbor even caught a glimpse of him dancing with a life-size doll in his apartment. One day in October 1940, which was 9 years after Elena had died, Elena's sister decided to go see what was going on for herself. She went to Tanzler's apartment and she found her sister's corpse, or what was left of it, inside his apartment. The authorities were called and they removed the body, temporarily relocating it to a local funeral home for inspection. And then on further examination by 2 physicians, it was determined that Tanzler had also engaged in necrophilia, as a makeshift paper tube had been inserted into Elena's body to facilitate sexual intercourse.
And if that isn't wild enough, it just gets weirder. So after the secret was discovered, Tanzler was arrested and put on trial for wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. So that's where we pulled that crime classification from earlier. And while testifying in his own trial, because of course he did, he claimed that he planned to bring Hoyos back to life through, quote, intergalactic means. He explained that he wanted to take Hoyos high into the stratosphere so that radiation from outer space could penetrate Elena's tissues and restore life to her somnolent form. However, Elena's family would not get the justice they deserved. At the end of the trial, the county solicitor and defense attorney agreed on a release due to the statute of limitations. Now, people of the town were absolutely fascinated. They paid $1 to see her body on display at the local funeral home. It was quite the public spectacle and scandal, and how incredibly awful for her family. Strangely enough, many locals took pity on Tanzler. Some local women even thought that the whole thing was exceptionally romantic. Elena was reinterred, although she was buried in a different, unmarked grave in order to keep anyone, including Tanzler, from causing the family any more grief. And also at the end of the trial, Tanzler had the gall to ask if he could have her body back, but thankfully that was denied. He was found dead in his home in 1952, his body having been there for weeks before it was discovered. A life-size doll reminiscent of Elena was found in his home, crafted from her death mask and made mostly of wax. He also, before his death, obviously, penned an autobiography called The Secret of Elena's Tomb that appeared in a pulp publication in 1947 called Fantastic Adventures.
So let's take a moment, as we do, to talk about what was likely going on for Tanzler psychologically. We have no psych reports or psych records to go off here, and there's no indication that any psych assessment was conducted at the trial. If there was, it would have been a very rudimentary type of evaluation compared to what we're able to do today as psychologists. So we're merely offering conjecture with limited information available regarding his behaviors and statements, something we really only do in really old cases like this, always with the caveat that the passage of time absolutely does change facts. So
Sure.
we are conjecturing off of what we have available to us now, understanding that it may not be the most accurate report of what actually happened. Even all of that being said, there's clearly some things going on here just from actual police reports and newspaper accounts.
Yeah, so aside what we already sort of in jest touched on as going through his story, I think we have to just discuss what's going on as far as a possible psychotic disorder here, because we have some hints of that, certainly. And recall, psychotic disorder is the big umbrella term that can include such diagnoses as delusional disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and the hallmarks of these disorders are going to be the presence of hallucinations, usually auditory or visual, and or just straight up false beliefs, which would be what we call delusions, or the delusional part. So if you'll remember, he claimed that as a child, and I'm not saying that he was delusional as a child, but he claimed that he was visited by visions of a dead ancestor, Countess Anna Constantina von Cosel, who revealed to him the face of his, quote, true love, an exotic dark-haired woman. So possibly a visual hallucination, perhaps. To break it down even further, when people have false beliefs or delusions, they can be bizarre or non-bizarre. So non-bizarre would be something that's possible, like believing your spouse is having an affair, whereas a bizarre delusion is one that is implausible, not understandable, and not derived from any ordinary life experiences. So, for instance, someone removes your organs and replace them without any visible scars. So, some things we kind of turn to in this story is that he believed he was under Elena's ghostly power. That's a terminology that was used in some of the research, and that his actions were not his as he stole her body, but at the will of Elena. So there are even some reports that he had a telephone system installed in the mausoleum with one receiver inside and one outside that he could sort of talk with her, which I don't know why, because obviously he had a key to just go on in there. But essentially, he claimed that through these phone calls, she eventually told him that she was ready to go home and be with him and marry him. And then you'll also recall that he was hoping to really just bring her back to life, very Bride of Frankenstein, by somehow sending her up into space. And this seemed to be not like this delusion that manifested 9 years after she died. When he took her from the mausoleum, he actually took her body in essentially this wagon that he had made to look like a spaceship. So, I mean, there's some stuff going on here, even earlier up until this was all found out. So he was kind of keeping her body in this quote unquote aircraft while trying to resuscitate her. And since there's a presence of both hallucinations and what I think are disorders, I would definitely make the leap that he was likely suffering from a disorder associated with the schizophrenia spectrum. I mean, obviously, I don't know what, notwithstanding being able to know much more, but I would really like to know more about his history before he came to Florida. I think that would put a lot of these pieces together. But what do you think is important to talk about of what might be going on here for him?
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. It's fascinating, and we could be here for another 2 hours just on this case, but I won't subject people to that. What pops out for me is the abrupt leaving of his family. What we don't know in the
Sure.
timeline is, had he already been allegedly in contact with his deceased alleged relative? We don't know if there's actually any proof that he was related to this royalty. But the grandiosity of that is certainly an element, like you're saying, on the schizophrenia spectrum, where an individual will think they'll have sort of grandiose ideas about who they are, connected to like higher levels of royalty or power or specialness in the world. So he adopts this new identity. One of the things that we talk about, though, in differentiating within the psychotic spectrum when it comes to delusions, he may not have actually been hearing the voice of his dead relative. He may have interpreted data around him as, oh, my relative, the Countess, is sending me messages. He
Right.
could have been at the beach watching waves and then interpreting a pattern. One of the most interesting cases I've ever worked with was an individual who believed that a celebrity was sending her messages through the music at Starbucks.
Oh,
So she would
okay.
sit and listen to the music, and she was really convinced that this person was telling her to come to their home. Very interesting stuff. It's a misinterpretation of data. Now, also, there is an erotomanic fixation on the young woman.
Right.
Tanzler was obsessed with her. He clearly did not understand boundaries. The affections were not returned. The family probably thought, well, I mean, he is the doctor, but this is getting a little bit weird. So there's a real boundary issue there. Not saying that boundary issues can't exist in people that are not mentally ill. They just have maybe not the greatest social skills. There's certainly something going over here that maybe he's on the spectrum in another way. Could have been
Hmm.
maybe within the ASD. And then also there's obsession and traumatic grief. And traumatic grief is trauma to our system, and it can literally rewire our brains. Obsessions are unrelenting and generally unwanted thoughts and ruminations that can cause a great deal of distress in people. And obsessions can come from a variety of areas in our lives, and it can be triggered by a number of events. Obsessions can cause such deep anguish and despair that the individual experiencing them can go to extreme lengths to attempt to block and resist them. And unfortunately, obsessions take many years to develop and emerge, and therefore they are difficult to treat and control, as they can return within a short period of time after remission. Tanzler's obsession epitomizes a form of erotic fixation on his alleged soulmate. And this type of fixation is challenging enough, but when it's framed in this larger paradigm of psychotic delusion, it's a whole different challenge entirely. So while most people can adjust relatively well to the loss of a loved one to death, others, including children, may have ongoing difficulties that interfere with everyday life. And when an individual has an altered baseline of emotional functioning, this grief can exponentially be more significant and aggravating their already impaired functioning.
Yeah. So if you and I were to team up and write an assessment report on Tanzler, we might put something together like Tanzler caught in a mental and emotional labyrinth of psychosis, obsession, and traumatic grief, acted out in a twisted desire to be with his beloved forever, hoping to conquer illness and death itself. So safe to say that likely some psychosis coupled with the obsession with Elena then could have led to severe traumatic grief, eventually causing him to do what he thought he had to do to live with her forever. And what he got was, well, he didn't even get desecration of a corpse. He essentially was, all these charges were dropped against him. So such an interesting case.
It is interesting. And by the way, that is absolutely, if I was in a courtroom and I had a colleague writing something so beautiful, I mean, that's a really elegant description of what happened, and it would be a great defense, right? I mean, to understand the impact of mental health issues on him. Now, let's make it a little bit more complex before we go to the next one. If he didn't think she was dead, is it actually necrophilia? So it's definitely desecration of a corpse, whether he thinks it is or not.
So from the outside, we would go, oh, yeah, it's totally necrophilia. But if he's not sexually attracted to corpses, he's sexually attracted to Elena.
Right. He's still having sex with her remains. I mean, it's also interesting because this is at the time when Nikola Tesla was having all of these experiments with electricity and radiations. There could have been certainly Tanzler sort of integrating or inculcating experimental or like fringe science at the time to think that this would be, a way he could bring her back to life. Interesting stuff.
I think he thought she was dead.
You think?
And
okay.
Even though maybe she was like kind of communicating with him from beyond.
She was somnolent.
There you go. Oh my gosh. Well, let's cover a little bit more recent one before we wrap up necrophilia like a mummy.
Before we mummify ourselves. Yeah. So Karen Margaret Greenlee, born in 1956, is an American criminal known for stealing a hearse and having sex with a corpse that the hearse contained. She is dubbed the best known modern practitioner of necrophilia. I think that's a really dubious title, but I'm not even sure who dubbed her that, but it's clearly somebody decided that they would. And her case drew significant attention due to her gender, right? So only about 10% of known necrophiles are women. And the detailed interview that she gave about her necrophilic practices in the anthology Apocalypse Culture are significant. So Greenlee was able to communicate to her interviewers that she experienced sexual trauma early in life, having been molested at age 8 and raped by a teacher at 14 while living in Sonoma County, California. She later moved with her family to Colfax, California, where she graduated from high school. At the time of her arrest, she was separated from her husband. She was working as an apprentice embalmer at the Memorial Lawn Mortuary in Sacramento, California, and she stole a hearse on December 17th, 1979, along with the body of a 33-year-old man. She was found days later near Allegheny, Sierra County, after attempting suicide by overdosing on pills. Police discovered a confession in which she admitted to having sex with 20 to 40 corpses. Since necrophilia was not illegal in California at the time, Greenlee was charged only with stealing the hearse and interfering with a funeral. She pleaded guilty and received a sentence of a $255 fine and 11 days in jail, followed by mandatory therapy.
So Marion Gonzalez, who was the mother of John L. Mercure, the corpse involved in Greenlee's crime, sued Greenlee and the mortuary for $1 million, citing severe emotional distress, and the lawsuit was settled for $117,000 in damages. In 1987, Greenlee gave an interview titled The Unrepentant Necrophile for the book Apocalypse Culture, where she detailed her necrophilic interests and experiences. She later regretted the interview, changed her identity, and just completely relocated. Her story inspired Barbara Gowdy's 1992 short story called We So Seldom Look on Love, which led to the 1996 Canadian film called Kissed. The film featured Molly Parker as a protagonist, explored similar themes, and won Parker an award at the 18th Genie Awards. Greenlee also contributed to the book The Gospel of Filth and inspired the rock musical The Unrepentant Necrophile by the Cold Hearts. Greenlee described herself as a, quote, morgue rat and referred to necrophilia as an addiction for her. Despite the controversy surrounding her, her case remains one of the most infamous instances of necrophilia in modern times. So with that, I mean, we always got to touch on entertainment, and there are a couple things to, no pun intended, touch on here.
Yeah, and even this first one, which is so good, is something that we used in our previous episode about the morgue crimes.
Right. So that was the X-Files episode Irresistible, which is the 13th episode of the second season of the wonderful TV show, The X-Files. I just saw a blurb about how significantly women going into STEM careers happened after The X-Files and how Agent Scully inspired them.
Yeah, it's even a stronger influence than Jodie Foster in Silence of the Lambs. But that's both of those being huge cultural impact on women in these fields.
So in this episode, FBI agents Fox Mulder, aka Dr. Scott, and Dana Scully, aka Dr. Shiloh, investigate a series of grave deaths in Minneapolis where the bodies have been exhumed and mutilated. And the case leads them to Donnie Pfaster, a seemingly ordinary man with a sinister obsession with death and necrophilia. Pfaster's escalating behavior includes targeting living victims, posing a significant danger to those around him. And the episode delves into the themes of human depravity and psychological horror, of course, showcasing the agent's pursuit of a deeply disturbed individual who challenges even their understanding of evil. Interestingly, the original script for the episode depicted Pfaster as a necrophiliac, but this was deemed unacceptable for broadcast standards by the Fox Broadcasting Company at the time. And series creator Chris Carter explained, quote, when I submitted the script, it was initially for a necrophiliac episode, but that idea was rejected. Network television cannot combine themes of sex and death, end quote. As a result, Carter had to revise the script, transforming Pfaster from a necrophiliac to more of a death fetishist. I guess that's better.
That's better.
And reducing the emphasis on his sexual obsession. So they kind of let that element out. But Carter believed that the sexual undertones were still implied and understood by audiences, and that Pfaster remained a disturbing character, particularly due to his creepy arrogance when using shampoo on his victim's hair.
So did I ever tell you the story about meeting that actor?
I think so.
So I'm blanking on his name, but he is really tall and very imposing, and he's a really, really great actor. But because of the way he looks, and he's not an unattractive man, he's very, very masculine, but he has, he just has this look that, you're going to be cast as bad guys. I ran into him at the gym, and I was such an X-Files fan, and I kind of fanned on him. I'm like, that was such a cool episode, and blah, 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 blah. And the guy looked at me like I was a complete nut job.
Oh, no.
I completely understand why. If you don't, it's like actors are professional performers. They aren't necessarily, engaged in the particular fandom of the shows that they're on.
Sure,
it's like,
of course.
You may be a working actor that has no interest in science fiction, but you're working on a science fiction series for 10 years or whatever. So I just remember suddenly, here I am like a foot and a half shorter than him. And this guy's like, what's with this
Oh,
weirdo? And he's
he's
like running to
really
the other
good
side.
looking. Nick
I think so
Chunland?
too.
Nick Chunland?
Yes, that's it. But
Wow. Yeah.
he's not like Hollywood handsome.
Right.
He's like rough and tumble handsome kind
Yeah.
of, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the example I wanted to use that I started off with at the beginning is Kieran Culkin's character in Succession.
Say
Now,
that 3 times fast.
seriously, right? So, folks, don't know if we've talked about this before, but I am completely late to the game on Succession. Dan and I have never watched it. And people kept saying, I can't believe you're not watching this. And I would tell like Dee Dee, our
Uh-huh.
psychiatric nurse that we work with. And she'd go, oh my God, Scott, you're going to love it. You're going to love it. And I'm like, I cannot watch a show about sociopaths. What I didn't understand, and narcissists, but what I didn't
Mm-hmm.
understand is how funny it is. Like
Okay. I haven't watched it.
it's really good. And it's I didn't realize what it was based on. It's like basically sort of a fictionalized version of Rupert Murdoch and his
Mm-hmm.
family and Fox News. And holy crap. I mean, the acting is just top notch. But Kieran Culkin plays the youngest child of this Roy family. And they are a dynasty that's been running this ultra right wing news agency. And Succession is the show that has been following all of their lives. I think there's 5 seasons, and the company is called A-Star Royco, and it's a global media and entertainment conglomerate, I guess. And then the patriarch, Logan Roy, just this ruthless, narcissistic, sociopathic, domineering, manipulative figure. And his declining health just starts this power struggle between all the siblings. And there's Kendall, Roman, Siobhan, and Connor. And each of the siblings vie for control of the family empire. But what's really interesting is all of them have like really strange things about them because they've been emotionally abused as kids.
Right.
Roman Roy, played by Culkin, is just this brilliantly annoying, creepy, sad, unsettling character. Like you don't like him, but you're completely fascinated by him because he's very smart, but he's so fucked up that it like completely overwhelms how smart he is. And they hint throughout all the seasons that he has this underlying sort of somnophilic or necrophilic issue. He has huge sex problems. He can only get off if he's being like verbally abused. And then
Mm-hmm.
when he's got a girlfriend, like he tries to have her like, will you, hey, I'd really get into it if you wouldn't move. And,
Got
if
it.
you like get into the bathtub for a while. And there's a sexologist writer, Dr. Patty Britton, who's written some really interesting stuff out there. And she has a great opinion there. There's also something about his longing to be in a role play with a dead person that is so utterly reflective of what I think is going on for him. For Roman, it's symbolic of his own deadness. He's emotionally dead. He's sexually dead.
Ooh.
So, I
Love
mean,
that.
she's a sexologist, so I don't know clinically how that would relate, but certainly that'd be a great way. Like if we were able to get a subsection of people to do, sort of intense MMPI and other sort of tests on, that would be very interesting to explore that particular area.
I think, can anyone offer Scott and I jobs to just like offer our input on
Yeah.
characters on television shows and get paid well for it? And
yeah, exactly. Just pay me to mouth off about television shows.
I mean, we'll make it
It is a
very
career,
profound
actually.
like that.
Critics do that, right?
Well, critics do, but we're not movie critics. But I would love to write something flowery and just sit back in my pajamas for the rest of the day.
That'd be great.
And watch the next episode, right? Okay, so lastly, we have if you prefer your cinematic necrophilia with some vintage vibes, then look no further than 1972's Love Me Deadly. So this is a film directed by Jacques Lasseret. This retro take on the frowned-on sexual act follows a Los Angeles heiress being initiated into a necrophilic cult. Great, we got the cult checkbox there. And it's run by the local morgue worker, which is also called a diner. Not where you eat, but die, D-I-E-N-E-R, in his mortuary. So Lindsay must learn to navigate being newlywed with her penchant for the newly deceased. She forms a relationship with a funeral director named Alex, who also shares her dark inclinations. As Lindsay becomes more entangled in the world of death, she discovers a cult of necrophiles leading to a series of disturbing and deadly events. So Love Me Deadly hits all the right notes when it comes to the 70s horror perfection. Its blend of whimsical pop music, groovy fashion, and depictions of satanic cult rituals makes it the perfect feature film for those looking to dabble with necrophilia and horror without taking it to the extreme.
Exactly. I think it's is it a TV movie or is it a
I
feature film?
don't know. I do not know. I couldn't find much than, obviously these descriptions about it.
We'll
But
have to look. Maybe we can do a watch party. I'll have to look for it because the funeral director is played by Lyle Wagner, who was like such a hunk at the time in the 70s. He was he was on the Carol Burnett show, and he was like sort of the handsome comic relief. So
wow,
the
another
film
hot guy into dead people.
and exactly, they're all trying to get us into
God,
necrophilia, I guess.
Hollywood.
So I have not seen the movie. It's supposed to be ultra low production value and has uneven pacing and an inconsistent story and dated special effects. But critics do review that it was really bold subject matter for 1972 as compared to the concerns of the 1990s X-File episode.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's so funny.
So the movie actually had a willingness to delve into these taboo topics, and that set it apart from more conventional horror movies of the time. And then there's a cult subplot that adds this additional layer of horror. So
always.
There you go, folks.
Yeah. Phew. You guys made it through. All 4 of you who are left listening by this point. We appreciate you.
I know. You know what just occurred to me also? I mean, and people will get this, but like, I don't really obsess about reviews. I'm always surprised by them because some of the comments just are like, wait, what? And a couple of the reviews that we've gotten are talking about, they don't really go into the science very much. I'm like, are you kidding me?
The very few and far between negative ones.
That's true.
You only
Very
bring up
few
the
and far
negative
between.
ones. So
Right.
it's not as if that's all we're getting, guys.
No, we get lots of
appreciate
really
all of you who are lovely and give us feedback.
and
But,
also constructive feedback, which is very helpful. We always appreciate that.
So this has been on my list for a very, very, very long time, and it just has never felt like a time to dive into it. I feel like with us coming back, we've dabbled in a little bit of everything, and I was like, we need a hard-hitting paraphilia to get into. So what are we covering in our next episode, Dr. Scott? For a little teaser. We're doing a little review of a couple topics, right?
Yeah, no, I got your permission to do this. I'm getting very excited. So we did an episode way back in the day. I think maybe our second year of production, we did an episode on Folie à Deux. And Folie à Deux is actually kind of coming back into cultural discussion because of a couple of cases have reemerged. Like initial cases from about 10 years ago are back in the news for various reasons. The new Joker movie also is entitled Joker Folie à Deux. Yep. So we wanted to build on actually some updates on these criminal cases and updates on shared psychosis.
Yes.
We touched on it a little bit today, talking about psychosis, but we're going to go even further deeper into that for our next episode.
And now, as of this week, Chad Daybell is convicted. So we got that.
And that's part of it. Yep, that's one of the cases.
All right, guys, thank you so much. We will see you next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Take care, guys.
Bye.
We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawlspace Media Network. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
Our theme music, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons Attribution license. Please check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on X at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Once a month, we go live on YouTube on a Saturday afternoon, so pay attention to our social media announcements to join our interactive broadcast Behind the Couch, where we interview guests on a number of psych, criminal justice, and true crime topics.
And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Okay. And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, additional content, host interaction, and you'll be the first to know about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag.
Thanks for listening, and join us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential.